after the contract is signed, what other legal procedures and processes need to take place?
After the contract is signed and the legal clearance information is sent to the clinic, other than fulfilling the terms of the contract, there's no legal activity that takes place until about week 20, or the midway point of the pregnancy. That's when parentage needs to be established in the intended parents, because without that, obviously anybody who's carrying a baby is presumed to be the mother, the legal parent of that child. So we have to show that this is not the case. And the only way we can show that is with documentation and a court order that parentage resides in somebody else or in two other people. So that's when the lawyer who has drafted the contract for the intended parents in the state where the carrier lives comes back again for the second part of his or her representation. And that is the pleadings, the application related to the parentage documentation, which has to be signed off ultimately by a judge in the state where the carrier lives and will deliver. So that's the second part of that lawyer's work.
And that happens before the baby's born.
Yeah, the beginnings of that occur at around week 20 in most states. And then the idea is to do it early enough so that the parentage order will be signed prior to the delivery, even if the delivery should happen sooner than we would expect or hope for. If there's a multiple pregnancy, we certainly start it by week 20, sometimes even earlier than that, because the delivery may very well happen in week 34, 5, 6, something like that.
And this allows the intended parents' names to appear on the birth certificate, correct?
Ultimately, yes. Although the birth certificate is not a legal document, the court order of parentage is. The birth certificate is an administrative document, which is drafted as a result of the legal document, which allows it to be drafted. So what we're trying to do is get a court order of parentage, similar to what you would get in adoption. When you adopted a baby, the judge signs an order that day, an order of adoption. Everybody knows that these are the parents now and everyone's happy. Then later on, the instructions go to the Department of Health to redraft a birth certificate with the new names of the parents and the name of the child that the parents have selected. It's similar in that way with a surrogacy. There's a court order of parentage for the to-be-born child, it's called, as opposed to an adoption where you can't do it until the child's born. So the court order happens usually somewhere in the beginning of the third trimester, and that's exciting. And the intended parents realize that we are now the legal parents of this child, and therefore we are responsible for this child now. So we are responsible if there's something that happens during the course of the pregnancy, or if there's a premature birth, they are still the parents. They are legally and financially responsible for the child who has not yet even been born. But once the baby is born, that document, that parentage order, is then used as a basis for the birth certificate application, which is then sent in just as any parent would fill it out in the hospital. When a woman has a child, they fill it out with the name that they've selected. But in this case, it's filled out with the name or names of the intended parents as mother and father, or parents if it's a same-sex couple, or just one person if it's a single person as parent, and the name of the child that they have selected with the surname, usually, of the intended parents for the child. And then they get a birth certificate later on from the Department of Health or Vital Records in the state where the baby has been delivered. And it doesn't have any marking on it that says surrogacy, or it doesn't look any different than what you would get if you had a child on your own. Some people are concerned about that. You're completely credentialed in the same way that anyone else would be. And the baby comes home with you from the hospital, and you ultimately, a few weeks later, usually get that birth certificate or a few certified copies of the birth certificate. And that's the end of the legal proceedings. There are times when we can't get a pre-birth order of parentage, and I want to go through a few of those instances. We usually try to do it early enough, and we work in states where there's a structure for this so that we often get it. We hardly ever miss getting it, but many times, just about all the time really, it's up to a judge to decide whether to grant this order of parentage. And when there's a donor material being used, or a judge can be particularly curious, or the county is changed a little bit with its landscape or with its posture, sometimes a judge may be a little skittish or unwilling to do or to sign off on a pre-birth order of parentage. And in a case like that, what happens is the baby still goes home with the intended parents if there's a parentage order. And if there isn't, the baby still goes home with the intended parents, but there needs to be obviously some sort of legal document indicating parentage. And that's when an adoption would take place after the baby is born. Nobody really wants to have to adopt the child that they consider to be their own, or that certainly in many respects genetically is their own. But that sometimes, rarely these days, but really it's a possibility, is the only way sometimes to get legal parentage. So we can talk a little bit more about the adoption, but there's another thing that's important to understand as well. Not every order can be granted ahead of the birth. If there's a delay in the court system, and with COVID sometimes closing courts recently, there have been things that have been taking longer. And if the baby is born sooner than we think, earlier than we think, sometimes we don't have that order at the time the baby's born. And the planning for a pre-birth order of parentage has to be converted into a post-birth order of parentage. Much of the documentation is the same.
I want to ask about, what does the hospital staff know about all of this? Are they informed that this is a surrogacy, and why these two strangers are hanging out, acting it's like their kid when this other woman's giving birth? Can you explain how that works?
Well, everything is planned and prepared for ahead of time. The hospital knows about the circumstances of this rather unique case. We work in hospitals where they are not unaware of surrogacy. They've seen cases and worked on cases, but it's clearly not the average case that they work on all the time. Most of the time they welcome this. It's different. It's heartwarming. It's a wonderful story. But we always make sure that the social workers, the nurses at the hospital, are fully aware of the circumstances here, of the legal documents that have been prepared and signed off on and achieved ahead of time. And the parties have actual copies of these orders with them, just in case someone asks for that. So everyone's prepared for it. And the intended parents are often given the exact same, sometimes more accommodations than just other parents that are having a child at that hospital would get, because it is so special and unique.
Oh, that's great. Excellent.